So going to and everybody just yeah. Yeah. So yeah. Very good. Very good. Yeah. Yeah.
It's one or
My husband is from Ohio. Yeah, yeah, so he had to pick from there's the a young man. He's from so
So it's because someone's, yeah. You do, right?
Yeah, so yeah, he's
On here, but it's
okay, mine's 7. Windows, yeah, Windows like there, yeah, take it, yeah. But also today, convinced my son to, but I was like, which is really clean, but I'm learning.
Yeah, it's a yeah.
Warning, right? What is going on here? I know, I just try to think it should be like a thing. It's so fun. He's not super crazy, but it's super. I know. Yeah, I saw so it's like in Detroit when our friends had cakes. Like comparison wins and that's like the entire country one of the lines. Yeah. Yeah, anyways, I'm sure there are many more people to survive.
There's gotta be a lot.
Okay.
As our figure, I just want to make sure that that's what's already in the world. Alright, so.
Yeah. Going well.
We're good.
Yes. Candidates for this my second round we've got 4 candidates that are on a narrow. One of them. Actually, and then I'll set you those.
Probably on survey.
That's no problem.
It's great. It's really like it. After spending the vast majority of my life over the very like good special in your chest.
That's something that he didn't end up.
Let me sign it in my too.
So he ended up Korean.
Like November they can go and see
So he had a theorist trying to supervise.
So like it's not that's the
dissertation. So he struggled on the job market, which is cool for us. Yeah, I actually have a job. But so we'll see. Necessary. And yeah. So regional, and various.
When we get to see.
We did this. Let me know if y'all need.
All right, good morning. On behalf of the Early Childhood Care and Education Commission, I call this meeting to order. Well, oh, we got slides. So thank you. Yeah, thank you. You can go ahead. Yes, thank you. May we have a roll call, please, Amy?
Senator Beth Mizella. Representative Stephanie Hilferty. Dr. Stephen Barnes.
Here.
Melissa Dudo. Here. Ruth Lawson. Jan Moeller,
Here.
Stephen Procopio,
Melinda's a lot here for Steve.
Dr. Libby Sonia.
Here.
Michael Tipton,
Join yet? Okay, I think Michael's gonna join us virtually a little later on after one of his other meetings ends, so. Okay, so we do not have a quorum. Since we do not have a quorum, we cannot take a motion to receive item 3, the consideration of an update report regarding the meeting held December 15th. But we can give you a moment to look over those minutes and let us know whether you see any corrections that might need to be made. Any notations? Okay, thank you very much. So Nikki, please help us with language, but I believe since we don't have a quorum, the meeting officially ends, but we will continue with discussion today. So we will now turn to item 4, consideration of discussion regarding funding design principles for early childhood care and education. I'm sorry, let me pause before that. Let me make sure. I think she introduced herself individually to all of you, but let me introduce myself and let me introduce our new assistant superintendent. I'm Karen Powell, Deputy Assistant Superintendent for Early Childhood Care and Education here at the department. And with us today is our Assistant Superintendent, Melinda Baker.
Yes, and I don't know if I went over here, didn't go over here. When I assumpted I can recommend everybody at this table, correct? So definitely, if anything, I need to do my homework to come and meet with you. I'm always happy to connect one-on-one. Been excited to sit here today and listen and learn and grow. And so I offer myself as a thought partner in this work, but I'm definitely going to be deferring to Karen in terms of, as well as our presenters today. So nice to meet you all in person. It's lovely today. No, yeah, Monday morning.
All right, so we are very happy to have her here with us today and here on the team. And so apologies, now we will turn to item 4, consideration of a discussion regarding funding design principles for early childhood care and education. And we are pleased to have with us here today. Oh, I'm sorry, before we turn to that, to frame that discussion, I just wanted to remind us all of the principles governing the commission and the task force. And so you know that 2022 legislation continues to charge the commission with making recommendations to establishing a vision for the future of early childhood care and education in Louisiana. And that the task force is charged with identifying and recommending alternative state and local funding strategies for quality early childhood care and education. And then as part of the 2023 legislation, Act 83 added in that the commission would, and the task force specifically, would also be responsible for working to identify and recommend a formula that could be used on an annual basis to determine the funding necessary to sustain and grow the early childhood care and education system, and any necessary legal changes needed to implement such a formula. And so to that purpose, we have with us here today 2 members of the Active Partners team who are working on helping to lead us through some of this discussion. You remember that they joined us for a task force meeting remotely in the fall, but we're very happy that they were able to come down and be with us here today and share with us some of their research about Louisiana, some of their research about what's happening in other states, and help lead us through some real brainstorming. My friend, over to you.
Great, I would start. Thank you so much. It's great to be here in person as compared to virtually last time. So we're thrilled to be here and thank you for letting us use some of your time together. So I think we only meet many of you in our virtual meeting last time, but just so everybody's aware, so we are Katie Reed and my colleague Abby McCartney with Active Partners. We are a public sector consulting firm. We've been around for about 13 years, and our goal is basically to create public policies, programs, and systems that drive effectiveness and sustainability in public systems, particularly growth and learning systems. We work across the ECE, K-12, higher ed, and workforce systems. And our mission is really to support both really creating the infrastructure and the systems that allow all people to thrive. So we've been around for about 13 years. I've been at Acton for 10 of those years. I'm a partner and managing director over both our K-12 and our early childhood systems practices with a strong underpinning in funding and finance. And so when we talk about things like funding formulas, while most people don't dream about funding formulas, I do. And I really do appreciate them. So I've been here doing this work for about 10 years. We've been in 39 states, DC and Puerto Rico. Prior to that, I came into this work as the chief of staff for the portfolio office at Chicago Public Schools. Where part of my charge there was to design policy for the movement from a traditional K-12 funding formula to a student-based weighted student funding formula at Chicago Public Schools. And I came into that work with 10 years of experience in the corporate sector, working in budgeting and funding policy. So I really do sort of have this in my background and my blood. I'm based in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I think most critically to this work, I have 2 young children. So one is 3, is in a preschool program after having to take her out of the closing early childhood childcare program. So I understand these issues. And I also have a 7-year-old. And so that's me in a nutshell, and I will hand it over to Abby.
Good to be with you all. I'm Abby. Probably most relevant to this discussion is that I started my career as a teacher in Jefferson Parish, not too far here. So it's great to be in Louisiana and work with you all. I've worked in the school districts. I worked in the Camden School District in New Jersey and at the federal level in the Senate for a while. And I'm thrilled to be with Acton and thinking about these issues.
Thanks. All right, I'm going to try and move this forward, and I think it's reversed from my Mac mouse. So if I mess this up, I'll apologize. So just quick lay of the land of what we're hoping to accomplish today. This is just a step into our agenda and what we're going to be talking about. We will go into the objectives of what we're hoping to actually achieve in the meeting. But last time we went over, when we met over the very basics of the work that we're doing here, the goals of this work, what it is, what it means to create a funding formula and funding policy. And really dug into what are the guiding principles for how we want to go about this work, and then how do we think that this work of funding design, funding formula can support the overall vision for an effective early childhood system here in Louisiana. Today, we're going to go in deeper. So we're going to talk a little bit about the current state of ECE in Louisiana. I think many of you have a lot to contribute to that conversation. We'll just go very lightly on the surface here. And then we're going to dig into funding design and understand what that actually means, what it looks like in practice, and what it can do in service of your overall goals for your system. And then from there, we're going to do a little brain exercise and think about what might it look like to apply your K-12 funding formula, the MFP concepts from that into early childhood. In no way, shape, or form saying that the MFP is the right solution for early childhood. Being somebody that works in both K-12 and ECE, I understand how dramatically different the systems are, but there are concepts that we just want to pressure test here and get a sense of would that work, something like this work for ECE, to understand where it might and where it definitely won't, so that we get some direction on the path that we might want to go forward here. And then we'll close with a little bit on next steps. So that's our agenda today. Quick reminder of our project goals. You'll see a bunch of color here. I know the orange is a little hard to read sometimes, but we shared this with y'all last time when we came virtually to talk about this project and our goals. And the items in orange here are things that you all as a task force gave us feedback on and said, you know, we actually think we're trying to achieve these things. And so this is where we landed out of that discussion in November. So our project goals to develop a funding design for Louisiana's early childhood care and education system that does these 3 things. 1, ensures access to high quality care and education and supports economic development in areas with the most need. 2, it distributes funding transparently. We can unpack a little more about what transparency means. And then 3, it improves quality, access, and sustainability by providing more stable resources for early childhood providers and the families they serve. So you all gave us feedback in these sections in orange. That added to the first bullet, adding in economic development, how important that is as a goal of this process. And then on the third bullet there, naming that stable funding is a means to this end of improved quality and access. So that's where we've landed with the goals. We just want to pause there and see if there's any questions or reflections on that. No, thank you for your contributions to that. Okay, so far I'm 4 clicks for 4 and not going in the wrong direction, so good. All right. So building on the agenda, here's the objectives that we have for today's session. We think we'll see if anybody has other things you'd like to gain out of this conversation. First of all, we want to align on priorities for what the ECCE funding design should achieve. So again, last time we talked about what could funding design do within promoting the overall vision for the system. Today, we're going to go a little bit deeper here and try and understand what do we want funding design in and of itself to be and to do. And then from there, we'll go into principles of funding design. What exactly is it? How do we use it to influence different things? And then again, like I said, objective is to consider how the M structure could or may not apply to ECE. And critically for us, identifying the key decisions that you all raised up along the way that we need to be considering. So selfishly coming out of here, we want to have a sense of where are your heads at in terms of the direction that we may go here, and what questions do we really need to be unpacking as we move forward. And then on the blue side here, I just want to plant the seed for us that it is really hard sometimes to think about a dramatically different way of approaching funding. A really dramatically different way of doing any of our work, but just want to lead in here with this idea of letting ourselves have a little intellectual freedom today. To enter this conversation out of a place of curiosity, out of a place of opportunity. I was laughing when I see these first two because my son is obsessed with space and curiosity and opportunity with the 2 Mars rovers. So that's a nod to him, but curiosity and opportunity, and then visioning, where do we want to go long term? What could be? What are the opportunities at stake here? And acknowledging that all reactions are good reactions, right? You may absolutely loathe some of the things that go up in the conversation today, and that is helpful and good for us to understand. So all reactions are welcome reactions. So we'll thank you in advance for that. And then, we also know that there are specific requirements that we have to meet when we design funding for this system. We understand that. We have a rich and deep background in understanding those requirements. And we will make sure as we move forward that we thread this needle between imagination and what could be with what must be and what the requirements are. But today we're going to allow ourselves that fun intellectual freedom. Okay. Questions on that? I still feel a little nebulous, but we'll get there. So next slide. Again, this is a slide that we talked about the last time we met in November, the guiding principles. So this is basically our commitments for how we're going to go about this work. And we use this as we go through the process to hold ourselves accountable to what we're designing, what we're developing, but also the way in which we're doing that. And you all opined on this last time, and so I'll thank you for that because we did make an edit to number 1, which looks like our font has gotten a little smushed there. But these are the guiding principles that we have. Number 1 is focusing on the needs of families and providers, as well as the opportunity for economic development, especially in areas with the most need. And so that feedback that y'all gave us was on number 1, this parallel focus on family and provider challenges and the impact on economic development. So for us, holding ourselves accountable to understanding the potential impact of decisions that we may be making together. And then other ones here, we will hold ourselves accountable to having research, evidence, and data-informed decision-making. We will start to bring that to the table today. There is much more to do here. And I know many of you bring a lot of that experience to the table too, and we welcome that. Inclusive engagement, particularly those that stand to be most impacted by the decisions that we're making. So we have had some conversations with stakeholders coming into this meeting. Abby will share a little bit about that so we can ground ourselves in that understanding. The next one I spoke about a little bit already, but this idea of embracing innovation while still being actionable and realistic. Last thing we want to do is draw up something, dream up something that becomes a beautiful plan that sits on a shelf, and we all know that that's a consultant's worst nightmare. So we're going to try and make sure that we're really thinking about being innovative, but also being actionable and realistic. Some of that comes in with sequencing timelines, transparency in process and recommendations, and then cross-sector collaboration. Those were the things we came up with last time. I will just pause and see if there's any additional items that anyone wants to brief timeline, moral of the story is we are here together for a good period of time, at least a year here, designing this funding design schematic. We are in sort of the middle, I would say, of gotten through contextualizing the work, doing some data collection analysis that is moving into the second phase of data collection analysis. We've done the goals, the guiding principles, and thinking about the methodology for the work ahead. We've done the focus groups, we'll share that today. So we're really into this planning phase here. We've got some very basic data that we'll share today, but we have a lot more ahead of us in data and analysis, and then developing priorities and scenarios for funding design. That's really where we'll be today, is priorities and scenarios for funding design. And then as we go through the summer, spring into summer, we'll be actually putting this all together, putting a tool together that will sort of ask for what are the big questions at hand, what are the inputs that we will have to decide upon, and coming up with different scenarios that we can bring back to you all to kick around as potential recommendations. And then in the fall, we'll wrap this up, bringing in feedback on those recommendations and developing a report. And we'll stay nimble and flexible through this process as we go. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Abby, who's just going to share a little bit about the current state of Louisiana to ground the conversation that we'll have as we move forward. Abby, your turn.
Yeah, I'm well aware that I'm probably one of the people in this room who knows the least about this, so really appreciate all of your the knowledge that you all are bringing into this. But just wanted to share a few things that to kind of ground us in some data as we go into this conversation. The first is around access to publicly funded early care and education, specifically for children under 3. So we know the focus of this task force is on infant and toddler funding. The graph that you see shows the percentage of children served in publicly funded programs across different years of age. So you can see 4-year-olds, about half are in a publicly funded program of some kind or another. That number drops to 22% for 3-year-olds, 12% for 2-year-olds, 9% for 1-year-olds, 4% for infants. So you can see there's a large gap there between the youngest children and slightly older children in terms of access to publicly funded programs and services. And then on the side, we have a couple of bullet points just reminding you all of what you have said in the past, which is in 2021, the commission reported that 114,000 children lacked access to high quality early care and education. And then the task force has recommended in the past investment that would increase the percentage of birth 3-year-old children served up to 66%. So that would be an increase over the current, pretty significant increase over the current number served. So some of what we're doing here is talking about existing funding and programs and making that work better for folks. And some of it's also about thinking about moving toward this expansion of access to publicly funded care and education for the youngest kids. And then just to bring another graph into it, we looked at the relationship across the state by parish between slots per child, so publicly funded child care center slots, Head Start programs, and school-based slots. And then we looked at that with the relationship to the poverty rate. So on the bottom, you see the percentage of children in poverty who are under 5, and on the side, you see the slots per child. You can see this graph is kind of all over the place. There's a lot of variation across parishes. There's a slightly positive relationship where the higher the percentage of the higher the poverty rate, the more slots per child, but it's not like a straight line, right? There's a lot of variation across parishes in how slots are distributed. And a couple of examples of that on the side, there are some parishes where there's about 1 ECE slot for every 10 children under 5. And then there are some where it's the sort of high end of that is 1 ECE slot for every 3 children under 5. And you can see some examples of different parishes that fall into those categories. Orleans, Jefferson, and Baton Rouge are kind of in the middle. They have about 1 ECE slot for every 5 children. So I think there's my takeaway from this is that the distribution of slots is, it really varies parish to parish, and there's not necessarily a very strong targeting of slots toward the highest poverty parishes right now. There's a little bit, but not very strong. Any questions about those 2 data points or graph?
Do you have the data that breaks it out by every individual parish? Is that something you can share?
Yeah, it's something you can share. And I know that some of it can be very small, right? So there's that can make the swing look.
We also have it on our website.
What are the two variables that I see on the block?
I don't have it in front of me, but I can look it up in the, we have a great, if they're smaller.
Curious.
Yeah, there are a couple that have zero, yeah. There's a couple of them. So the next few things I'll share are more qualitative,
If you don't mind, and sometimes that's because there is a lack of good providers.
yeah,
So that may be what's going on.
and if there's not kind of population densities to support a center or a Head Start program, that can be a challenge.
But it could likewise be a lack of awareness by families of the child care assistance programs. So there are a number of factors that come into play, but yes, looking at which parishes it is, we could determine better, is there any supply there?
So the next few things I'll share are more qualitative. This slide about what's most important to families is building off of the work of the Power Coalition, which did a series of 14 listening sessions in winter of 2022. And so, it's maybe a year or two old, but we'll share kind of what they heard from that. Families reported that wait lists were longer than ever, that they really felt COVID had exacerbated the shortage of ECCE slots, and that staff shortages continue to impact the number of slots, that they were finding that, firms had closed classrooms or that kind of thing because they couldn't hire enough staff. When families do obtain a spot, they often struggle to access CCAP subsidies in a timely manner. They had a really hard time finding non-traditional hour care, especially outside of New Orleans. So if they needed night or weekend care, that was very hard to find. And there were particular challenges for families of children with disabilities in finding the programs that are willing and able to support their child's special needs. And one participant noted that parents with special needs children are just not able to work because they can't find childcare that works for their child. So probably nothing too surprising there, but just want to bring a few family voices of what they're experiencing into the conversation. And then we'll also share, we did a couple of focus groups with providers in the last month or two. We thought it was really important to make sure that we're hearing from them directly on these issues around payment and funding in particular, because obviously they're the folks back to our guiding principles, the folks who are most directly impacted by some of these challenges. The font's a little wordy on this slide, but one thing we heard from them was that the payment structures across each funding source are really different, and that creates challenges depending on funding source for them to have financial sustainability for their program. So they really prefer pay based on enrollment rather than attendance. One participant shared that that changed to CCAP, being paid based on enrollment and not based on attendance has been a game changer, is the word she used. The timing of payments can be a challenge. Some programs pay in advance by the 1st or the 5th of the month. Some programs they have to wait until after they provided the care and then sort of submit for reimbursement, and that can be a challenge for them to be able to maintain their ongoing costs. CCAP payments are one of those that's received after the fact. So that makes it hard for them to support making payroll. Providers feel that programs that are paying in advance, like Head Start and the ECCE program in New Orleans, are working well. They really prefer that. And I think there's also this last quote that's long on the page really stuck out to me because we asked them, if you had a magic wand, what would you change? And this provider said, I get a different amount from every program. I get, $2,083 from the state match, $1,000 from city seats, $1,200 from early Head Start. But imagine everybody was giving us the same amount by the 5th of the month, that I could really plan. We can make a really high quality program and pay our staff what we need to pay them. And that really stuck out to me because I think that's a huge part of what we're trying to do when we're talking about funding design and funding formulas, is bring some coherence across all of these different sources and some predictability across all of these sources for providers who are kind of weaving together lots of different funding sources at the provider level.
If I could just add in there, I think, when we listen to all this, right, it really comes down into two things. One is how much, and the other question is how, right? So both of those things matter, how much funding you're getting, but also you see a lot of things in here that are more about how they receive funding, when they receive funding, the process through which they need to go to get that. So both those things matter, and it's important to think about that as we move forward.
And then the second part of this is maybe a little bit more on the how much side. We asked about serving infants and toddlers and what sort of barriers they face to expanding more seats for that. Most of the programs we talked to did serve infants and toddlers, but they had wait lists for those classrooms and were not able to open more classrooms due to the high cost for that age group. So they said, you know, infants are most in demand. We have wait lists. Some of them are because of demand for not enough spots, and some of them are because families are waiting for CAP funding to be able to enroll in those slots. They pointed out that some funding sources cap the total class size, even with like maintaining the ratios. They might say you can't have more than 8 infants in a room, even if you have you know, 3 staff in the room, you can't go up to 12. And then we had a couple of family home-based providers who noted that it was particularly challenging for them to serve infants and toddlers because of that like limited staff and the time that it takes to care for an infant. A big piece of this also is workforce, but their challenge to recruit and retain a qualified workforce really compounds that challenge of limited slots and being able to open more slots. And then we talked some about families and children who have special needs or behavioral challenges, to that point about the challenges that families face finding care. They told us, you know, we want to support them, but we feel like we need additional staff, we need coaching, we need someone who can kind of work with us and work with the child to support them. And they really had trouble supporting that on the sort of current funding that they were receiving. So there was one program that had a couple of sites, and they were able to hire one person across, you know, 3 or 4 sites who could sort of just focus on that, focus on coaching teachers and families and working with kids who had special needs. And they said that was really, really helpful. But most of the other programs were not at a scale where they could make that work. And so the first quote, I think, really speaks to the challenge that a lot of providers face with infant toddler slots. I always had 1 preschool classroom, but when I looked at my budget, I had to take more preschool kids because if not, I would have gone out of business. So their margin on their preschool classrooms was much more positive than on their infant toddler rooms. And so they had to have more preschool rooms in order to kind of balance the budget. Questions or reflections on what we're hearing from folks?
I would say it's pretty spot on. Being at a provider level, all of these things are things that we struggle with daily.
It's not unique to Louisiana. We do this work all over the place, and you know, I hear from very similar stories from providers across the country. So, and you know, the workforce challenges are everywhere. So it's, you know, again, like I don't know that we were surprised by anything, but it is always very helpful to hear it in you know, directly from folks who are experiencing. So we just grouped together, you know, across all of these different conversations we're having, our previous conversation with you all, some conversation we've been having with Karen and her team, and also, you know, hearing from folks in the field. We're kind of starting to document some things that we're hearing that are considerations or things that need to be true of whatever we create, and just documenting a few of those here. The first is we heard from you all really clearly last time, that we need to avoid penalizing parishes and local governments that have already begun investing in ECE. We don't want them to receive less funding because they've already started to invest. From the legislative charge, we know that we need to develop a formula that can be ongoing without need for annual reauthorization. We heard from you all last time that we want to be able to reflect the true cost of serving all children who need early care and education, to that point about the gap between children currently receiving it and children who could benefit from it, as well as serving children at different poverty levels. So looking at what those different scenarios could look like. We need to develop something that works for all key funding streams to avoid having multiple separate systems. We don't want to develop something that, you know, only works for state funding and doesn't work for CCAP, because that just, you know, recreates the problem that folks are having with meeting different requirements and working in different systems. And along with that, federal funds have to meet federal requirements. And then preserving family choice of type of care and location of care, something that's important to the families and providers and the folks we talk to, that we don't want to be in a situation where we're pushing folks into one setting by, you know, incentivizing funding that way. That needs to work across different settings. Are there other things that come to mind for you all that are like needs to be through this homework if this isn't true? And we can come back to that question as we move through other pieces.
One of the things I continue to think about is how we use our federal dollars, kind of like how we would use them in an early intervention program of, you know, payer of last resort. And then how do you scale payer of last resort with maybe the block grant dollars and figure out a funding formula that would help as many families as we can, because we know even middle income families are really struggling with how to afford childcare. And so it's just that pair of last resort sense piece for me that I keep thinking about with the block grant dollars.
Thinking about the puzzle and how you fit.
Yeah,
This piece is shaped this way and it can't change
And
because
start
federal,
really
so then.
Yeah, and then federal dollars, and then how do you,
Right. How do we maximize all of the sources that we have
Right.
access to?
That's a great transition into the next section. So we're going to talk a little bit abstractly and generally about funding design for early childhood education. And then we'll get a little bit more concrete by talking about the MFP.
Okay, awesome. So last time we met, we went over these sort of circles here. We've been talking about how funding design supports our broader system goals. And you all had some discussion and raised up ways in which you think funding design can really support the system as we think about goals of access, affordability, quality, stability, and then the workforce, including the workforce within the system. Where do we see funding design really promoting those goals? And you all landed on access, stability, and workforce really being the places in which funding design can promote these goals. But because all of these are connected, funding design would then inherently also improve affordability and improve quality as well. And Libby, what you just said around payer of last resort, maximizing all the funding sources. If we're doing funding design really well, we're improving stability, we're improving access, but we're also improving affordability if we can make sure that all of our dollars are going to their highest and best use, right? And then some of those middle income families that may have been pushed out of publicly funded systems could get back in. So it's a really important point there. There's a lot of ways in which funding design done well can support these system goals. So we want to ground ourselves in this concept of funding design is a lever to support reaching the vision that you have for your system. And then we also want to think about what good funding design looks like. So what does funding design have to actually look like to be able to reach this? And so we're going to go there next and talk about what funding design actually is, how we think about it, kinds of questions and answers, and then what we want to achieve within funding design. So funding design it's a system, a process, it's a tool that intentionally shapes the way that payments support your system goals. So there's two major components of this when we think about funding design. The first is funding allocations, which is how do we determine who gets how much money? And then the second piece is distribution mechanism. So how does that money then move from the state to the people that receive it? And there's a lot of decisions embedded within all of that, and we will get to those eventually. We're starting at this highest level sort of order of questions today. And so when we talk about a funding formula, that is a potential solution in funding allocations. So a funding formula would be a way in which we can determine how funding amounts should be determined for different folks that receive those dollars. It is inherently connected to distribution mechanisms. So we'll want to think about what would it look like if we were to determine that we want to go forward with the funding formula. Lots of questions on how that funding formula is developed, but then how do those dollars actually move out to the people that receive them? Because ultimately this needs to work as one big system of funding design. So funding formula is a component of funding design. That's how we situate them together. And so any questions on that? Sort of terminology. We'll talk about funding allocations, we'll talk about distribution mechanisms, and when we talk about funding formula, that is a potential solution for funding allocations.
Just to connect it back to the provider voice piece, I think a lot of the tension we heard around how to receive funding go into that distribution mechanisms piece of it. So that's very important to people's experience of it.
Right.
Knowing that our focus is more on the allocations piece for this project, but it's still an important.
That's right. Ultimately, we want to create a funding system that works with people that receive the funding and parents and families that have children participating in the system. So both those things matter a lot. Okay. So what are we ultimately trying to do here? Ultimately, what we're trying to do is historically, I would say our ECE system has really been done through the watering can perspective. Right, you've got each of these different, and this we wouldn't necessarily include all these funds into a funding formula. Totally understand that. But if you think about, your families that are sitting and ultimately receiving these services, all these funds are sort of independent, right? And so we're thinking about how do we want to distribute CCAP dollars? We're thinking about the formula that goes into that and how we're going to distribute that. We're thinking about that for matching fund, for Head Start, and all these different pieces. But we haven't really thought about it from the water or the flower pot perspective, right? Where is all this going? Are we making sure that the right amount of water is getting to the right flower pots based on what we think those flowers need to grow and thrive? So that's the concept here. We're trying to shift our perspective. When we think about comprehensive funding design, we're thinking about how we use all of the resources that we have comprehensively to make sure they are distributed across our flowers the way that we want them to be. And so that's where we're trying to go here. And I'll encourage everybody to go through this process to think about what would this look like if we take the flower pot perspective here. I will say, going back to the conversation that we had earlier about where your slots are located right now. Some of that can be because we're thinking about the policies, but we haven't thought about how is that policy playing out down on the ground. So, Karen, to your point, sometimes the workforce isn't there. We may be, thinking that we want to distribute certain slots in certain spots, but you can't actually open those classrooms because the workforce isn't there to support it. And so we need to think about this from what's happening on the ground with where that water is going. We've done a big study of this in another state for what it's worth, and your scatter plot is, like Abby said, very similar to what we've seen in other states, right? So in another state, we looked at every single funding stream, so all the watering cans across the entire state, across 700 geographies in the state. And there was absolutely zero correlation between where those dollars are going, where those slots are going compared to any kind of factor within the state, right? No correlation to poverty, no correlation to any kind of child or family needs, no correlation to race or demographics. And so, truly it's an opportunity to rethink about how we're doing this and think about, ultimately, right, policies experience through implementation. So to rethink how people are experiencing those policies. And then also have an eye on what is it going to take to bring those policies to life. So what do we need to do from a workforce perspective? What do we need to do from an incubation and capacity building perspective? It's really an opportunity to do that. And I would say you all are ahead of the curve here, right? We're really excited to be here doing this because nobody else is doing this yet. You really are leading the way here. Abby, anything to add to that? All right. So funding, that's what funding design is, right? Ultimately, we're trying to rethink our perspectives of where the dollars are going and how they're going out. So funding design done well, we think intentionally brings together these different funding streams, including federal, state, and local, some of which we have more or less control over, but we need to have an eye on it, right? We don't get to control where Head Start dollars are going, but we need to know that it's part of the puzzle, right? So we need to have an eye on it. So funding design done well intentionally brings together these funding streams to comprehensively use financial resources toward those system goals that we have, that you all have already started to define as a commission. Some of the principles that we think are there when this is done well are these on the right side. So with intentional funding design, we're thinking about these kinds of things. We're thinking about a system that has aligned funding. So funding is aligned across your different funding sources. You know how they are weaving together. It is intentional. It's also aligned to your strategy. Funding is targeted when intentional funding design is in place. So you know and you have named the priorities that you have and the child and family needs that are out there, and you are intentionally targeting your dollars to those needs. And you can name it, you can see it, right? Funding design done well is transparent. And not only is it transparent, meaning like people can see where the dollars are going and how it's going, but it's understandable, right? And so people understand how is this working, and I can see that play out in practice. It's not a black box. And it's stable, it's predictable for our recipients. And we've heard this a lot through the, again, the focus groups that we've had. And we hear that, generally across the country. And we always believe to do all of this, this has to be grounded in data and in community engagement and understanding that it's actually doing what it's intended to do based on data, right? Data inputs and data outputs, and that it is grounded in what people that are ultimately impacted by the policies are experiencing. Okay. Then we're going to move into a discussion on this. These may or may not be the right things for you all. So we want to hear from you on that. Abby, I think you're taking us next.
Sure. So this is sort of how we were thinking about each components. This is what we've come up with for what we think funding design can do. I don't think these are the only things it can do, and I would be really interested to hear you all about if there are other things that you're hoping to achieve with this process that
that might, not be on this list or might add different nuance to this list. So, just to sort of expand on each of these, the aligned piece is really taking from, each program being treated separately, each watering can having its own, rules in it and thinking and strategy, and then to shifting that to thinking about what are all the different revenue sources that we can combine in different ways to meet, to make up the resources that are needed on the ground. Oftentimes in ECE, funding can be kind of first come first serve or haphazard or whoever applies for it. Shifting that to targeting the funding based on child and community needs, based on the priorities that you all identified. Transparent, I think sometimes things are sort of a black box, and sometimes they feel like a black box because they're so complicated that no one really understands it. Shifting that to being transparent, easy to understand. And then, we've heard from providers that funding can feel unpredictable or variable, and moving that if they can count on and it's stable. On the next slide, we started to map out some things that Louisiana has already done with each of these strategies. There are things that are working well that can be built on, and there are also some places where there might be some gaps along these different principles. So the Ready Start Network is an example of thinking about alignment across and interactions across different programs and need in a region. There are targeted programs. There are higher subsidy rates for children with certain needs. That's an example of targeting funds. There's the move to setting subsidy rates based on market rates and cost of care is a move toward transparency. The matching fund is sort of open to anyone, and there's a kind of easy to understand way that dollars get matched. And then I know and there's been a big focus on stability around moving toward contracted slots and moving toward payment based on enrollment rather than attendance. Those are definitely strategies that move towards stability. So we'd love to hear from you all about what's working well that we can build on, where there are gaps, where you see a need for these principles, where there are tensions between these principles, because we know that sometimes if you lean really hard into one, that can affect one of these other ones. The more targeted your system is, the harder it might be to understand. So there could be a tension between those. And then also, are there other goals that you're hoping to achieve with funding design that are on this list? That's lots of questions. Yeah.
So like if we think about the LA4 funds, in a good year we serve over, around or over 90% of our corridors are at risk. But one of the issues that we have with LA4 funding is the funding is not always adequate to cover the space. And so while it's been somewhat more stable, you've still had an issue of being able to get the true cost of the care and education. And so, because it was the last session of the session before you went up, 1,000 piece. And so I guess I wonder, like, what's the formulary to figure out the LA4 dollars of what's, you have versus what's needed there.
Can I also add, isn't there a wrinkle in that we may not be able to continue using TANF money for the LA4 program? It's been dropping each year. Yeah. So it's possible that, yes, it's up. I mean, I don't know, but I'm imagining it's possible that at some point there might not be any TANF dollars to contribute to that. So the state ask has gone up the state contribution has gone up each year.
Then it's decreasing. Yeah. Because of what we are allowed to spend on TANF and the standard.
And with the new federal rule changes, what is the timeline for?
When with the new federal law, when we looked into it, it shouldn't drastically change how we spend on LA4. Although it could, if a state wanted to change how they use their TANF dollars and put more money into families' pockets to move forward, but it doesn't preclude what we're already doing.
Okay, so the funding that we currently have is not at risk.
Correct.
So yeah, so I'm just gonna try to take some notes up here. But one thing I'm hearing that is there's a relationship between all of these principles and also adequacy. Like it can be targeted, it can be stable, but if it's not actually adequate to cover the cost of providing the service, then that's a problem, regardless of.
And I'm trying to, years back, it used to be funded a classroom at a certain amount, and then it shifted somewhat to per child.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know when the shift occurred.
I'm
not sure it was a 20-year history, but I do know that now it funds per child.
Right. Yeah, and that's a real tension in this work because there's some benefits to funding per child, right? You can sort of track more carefully where the money's going, what the needs of the child, but children don't come in classroom sets, right? Like if you're running a program, you don't it's not like 60 kids all walking the door together. So sometimes the classroom costs and per child costs don't always like line up.
And if we're thinking about 1 to 3-year-olds, we're not talking about a school year either.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So with LA4 funds, you know, just bringing in a different perspective, while it was amazing for 4-year-olds statewide, that's really what started trouble for early learning centers, because all of the floors were pulled out and taken to public school setting. And 4s is where most centers make their money and then can afford to open other classrooms because of those high ratios and all those things. So when we're looking at like where funding comes from and watering the pots, that would be an example of, you know, I'm just gonna throw it out there, but like, how would early learning centers be able to utilize some of that money to bring kids back? Because what happens is the schools fill up and then those pre-K4 kids aren't served, but they're also not getting into early learning centers because of the waiting list and all of the issues with CCAP. So
I would also add, like in the 22 session, a bill by Cleo Fields passed that if a school district wanted to expand their 4-year-old reach, that they would have to do it in partnership with providers because of the very thing Melissa's talking about that we all know too well. Because he really wanted to make sure that really everybody really did have access, but understood once it was explained to them that it needed to be done in partnership with providers.
Yeah, and I'm gonna put that under alignment as an example of thinking about like, what is the effect of, if you do this with this program, what's the effect on all the other kids and providers in the system across other programs, right? Thinking about how those interactions work together, not a unique challenge at all. California is having a huge like blow up about transitional kindergarten and this exact challenge, right? So
20 plus years ago, when LA4 got implemented, there just wasn't a focus on P3. I don't think there was as great an understanding of childcare and the business model and what the implications would be.
Also, it was just earth shattering at the time and they were focused on pre-K.
right, yeah, I think
I remember
that. We don't forget we want to but yeah, but then thinking about like from the flower pot perspective, okay, if you move this watering can over here, what do you bring in?
But also the sense of that dosage matters, and that, so like 4-year-old programs are wonderful, but for a kid that is highly at risk, 1 year of intervention in a sense isn't gonna solve all the issues. And so you really want to, our most at-risk kids, we want to make sure that they have the highest dosage so that they would have access if families chose, you know, from 6 weeks or however old they want, all the way through 4 years.
So thinking about the targeting aspect of that, right, of like within empowered resources, who are the most at-risk kids and how, what do they need and what are they getting, so that it's like they're supported across all the different needs that they might have, which might include, you know, non-traditional hours care, might include care for special needs, right, depending on the child. So thinking about these 4 principles, first of all, I'm hearing maybe adequacy is something that we need to be working in here somewhere, of just, you know, making sure that the cost is covered, right? What else do you all see as a place where you want to focus or place of tension across those 4?
Well, I mean, I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it just to make sure the targeted part, to me, it seems like we should be targeting to the most at risk, and it should be a needs-based focus because we are limited in funds. So seems like we should be prioritizing money to the most at-risk children and the families that are less able to provide that care themselves.
And if we ever get to the point that we're serving the majority of our already, like what does a formulary look like across, you know, over time? It'll take us years to get to our most at risk.
So clear to start there and to build up.
Yeah, I did not mean that was the only, but I mean,
Yeah.
at the place that we're at
Really
now,
yeah.
like that should be the target in my mind.
So thinking back to that graph of like who served at what age group, the goal is not like to get to like 66% of infants right away, where you're thinking about within the at-risk group.
there other things that have been working well that we should be thinking about building on across these principles?
I mean, what the department has done with, attendance versus enrollment, like the stabilization for the providers. I mean, that would be devastating to switch back to that.
Should have providers moving forward.
But I wonder, so like with all the work that the department has done, that's really, it's a galvanizes registrar networks and how they function. But they really have so little purview over like how CCAP comes to their parish and those types of things. I mean, if they have local dollars that they're putting towards seats, they have a lot of purview about how that works. But if you think about the full system, they don't really have to say so.
The idea is with the contracted seats to work with those local networks to say, okay, where are your desert areas? Where are your high heat areas? Where are your most vulnerable populations? And that the networks within the contracted seats are going to identify. We need to reserve this many slots for Donaldsonville. We need to reserve, I forget which part of the Iberville parish it is, but we need to reserve this many slots for this corner of Iberville. Because otherwise there will be no early care there.
Yeah.
So I agree that hasn't been in place with the traditional voucher model, and it's something we're moving to.
But I think with that PDQ grant that we helped pilot that, I mean, that we're totally doing this, that's been a dream to get into what you just said. Yeah.
Yeah, and think about, when we think about the K-12 analogy, we haven't really had something like a school district in early childhood, right? Where there's like a local or regional body that gets the money and then decides how to spend it, right? That's not really the model that we've used. Pros and cons to that, right? We know school districts don't always, allocate their resources in the most, efficient way, but yeah, I think that's a real tension point, is like, how much do you lean on a local or regional decision maker to decide where things go, versus sort of drawing off of statewide perspectives, or knowing it has to meet federal requirements, all of those things.
I think you're raising a really important point about how interconnected governance decisions are here to the ways in which we can design funding. Certainly some to grapple.
This is spoiler alert. I think we probably have like a future meeting just all about the local role in this. I don't think we're going to get too deep into it today, but I think there's a whole conversation about what localities are. That's helpful. I think any other goals that we want to try to name that we want to achieve with funding design before we move forward? I'm realizing I probably can't read anything I wrote up there. But I think one reason we wanted to have this discussion with you all is that we realized as working through this that there's a lot of different things that we might need when we say we want a funding formula for early childhood. And those goals actually might not be all the same. So we want some alignment among this group around what are we trying to achieve, what do we hope to come out of this with for the system. And then those are the four that we've identified: advocating kind of adequacy and covering cost of care. Anything else people want to put on the table?
I wonder, since we have a star quality rating system, is there something that should be included looking at? I don't know if rewarding is the right term, but something that tries to incentivize people to improve in the rating system, but also reward those that reach a higher standard if we're trying to talk about the importance of quality. It seems as though the rating system we currently have should dovetail with the funding mechanism in some capacity. I'm not really sure how that works, but it seems like that should be part of the formula.
That there should be both to incentivize and also to acknowledge that operating a higher quality rated center often comes with higher cost, right?
Right.
That it needs to, maybe it's related to the sort of adequate funds point of like, there needs to be an acknowledgement of what those differences are, and that it should incorporate quality
Right.
Yeah.
But as you move up to, because I mean, it takes years to get to a point that you have like the highest quality and you've got people that are making benchmarks along the way. And I think that they would need to be incentivized to continue to learn.
And there might, if you look at factors such as this, you might need to look at other factors too, because some sites will take in children who have more behavioral issues or who have disabilities, and when you have a classroom full of children with behavioral issues, you're not necessarily going to be able to make the same quality gains. We talked to providers about that. Some providers who really sacrifice that public level of respect of choosing, you know, all right, I would love to advance my stars even more, but I'm gonna choose to be the one to take these children because no one else will.
Right. It has a factor in the population served in the sense of, you know, the needs of the individual students and also some concentration need, right? Like if you have a student that's serving a high percentage of economically disadvantaged, a high percentage of students with disabilities, there are additional challenges sometimes that come with.
One more thing that comes to mind, I think we've kind of touched on something along these lines a few places, but just big picture, the idea of targeting a limited pool of dollars and the tension between that and just scale, I'll say generally, right? So if we think about this analogy to the MFP for K-12 schools, if we decide to put extra dollars in per kid, there is a school where that kid can attend. And some parts of the state, we don't have the scale.
So yeah, seeing the
Targeting a
access.
small percentage of the population.
Yeah. Definitely. So you're saying like if we're really targeted about how we do this and we're really prioritizing the most at-risk kids, that might mean there are some places where there's just not access because there's not the dollars to support a broad enough part of the population to yeah.
The great plan may not always translate into the solution that.
Right. You think about those parishes that currently have 0 publicly funded slots, right? If it's because they don't have enough kids that would qualify for subsidies to the Individual Support Center, what does that look like? I think that also, I mean, that to me raises the question, like how do home-based providers fit into this as well? Because I think that sometimes can be like not the first thing that comes to our minds, but in places where there isn't like a large concentration of kids under 5, that can be a real solution because they're smaller scale, but making sure that it's sustainable for them in terms of funding, that funding sources are designed so they can really access them. You know, when things run through school districts, it needs to be kind of, the systems don't talk to each other as well. I think we're going to move to our next kind of thought experiment piece here, which is like looking at the MFP in relationship to early childhood. Yeah. Let's go to Sophie's. Yeah, we'll go here, and I appreciate that point because we can think about, you know, funding formula in terms of how do we better divvy up, if better is the right word, but better divvy up the pie today, or we can think about in terms of if we had more resources, how would we strategically divvy up those resources, right? And so both of those things can be true in what we're designing. We can think about long-term, what would it look like to design a funding formula if we had adequate resources, right? How would we want that to be driven? And then we can think about sort of stepping it back and saying, okay, well, starting with where we are today, what might it mean in terms of adjustments to how things work? And what might it mean along sort of increments along the way, right? So we'll think about all of those things, but it's a really important attention point to be considering, like, what frame of mind do we have, what lens do we have when we're having that conversation? And so I think, you know, as we go through this, we'll think about both sort of a near-term, pragmatic, realistic scenario, and then we can also think about long-term, what might it look like, what could it be? And part of the beauty of developing a funding formula, and what we've heard from several of you all through this process is, you know, having something on paper that says, if we were to bring more money into the system, what is the process through which that would be distributed, and how do we know that it would target what we want to target? You know, all those things can be true about what we design. Okay, so we're going to go through again a thought experiment here about applying the MFP to ECE. You know, we all know that again, you know, K-12 is a very different sector than the ECE sector for so many reasons. But the concept of funding formulas is quite frankly done very well in K-12. Not necessarily saying the MFP is the right formula, but generally across K-12, we see a prevalence of funding formula work. And typically, you know, there's a couple of different ways, generally buckets of ways that funding formulas are done. And you're probably familiar with both of these already. You already use these in different ways within your ECE sector. You also use them in Louisiana in your K-12 funding formula. And so the two different major sort of camps, if you will, of how funding formulas can be done is a resource-based funding formula or a weights-based funding formula. And so resource-based funding formula is basically, it allocates resourcing to providers based on the cost of their services. And so that could be things like personnel, so kind of teachers that are needed based on the kids that you're serving, the assistant teachers that are needed, other resources that are needed, facilities cost, materials, so on and so forth. And so you could literally see, you know, hey, here's on an Excel spreadsheet, all of the resources that we think different programs would need based on the population that they're serving. And that's the amount of resourcing, whether it's funding or direct resource allocations that a provider would receive. We do this in ECE cost of care modeling. So there's a big movement toward trying to understand the true cost of care within ECE programs. And we look at that by saying how many resources of what types are needed in different programs. So that kind of resource-based model is being done in ECE already. It's not necessarily converted into funding formula per se, but the concept is there and applies. A weight-based funding formula, on the other hand, is basically programs will receive like a foundational amount. Oftentimes, this is a foundational amount that's established through what's called an adequacy study. So, and I think your K-12 system does this, and you know, folks come in and say, well, how much is actually needed? There's an element of resource base in that to determine what is that sort of foundational amount that's needed. But that foundational amount is established. Sometimes it's based on an adequacy study. Sometimes it's just based on the amount of funding that's available. And then from there, there's additional weights that are applied based on specific types of needs or specific priorities. We see this a lot in K-12 funding formulas. Your MFP, your K-12 formula is pretty much a weight-based formula where you'll say, okay, these are the different kinds of needs that we see that are above and beyond the foundational amount or the core amount of funding, special education, children in poverty, English language learners, and you'll get an additional amount, a percentage uplift, if you will, for funding. We do this in ECE also, right? And so sometimes you'll see an uplift, like percentage uplift or an add-on in subsidies for specific geographies or specific needs or for quality factors. We'll see that sometimes as well. And again, you know, at the end of the day, both of these are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to say, what is a methodology through which we can target resources based on where we think the highest and best use of those resources is. Either way, whether you're doing a funding formula that is resource-based or weight-based, there's always going to be a set of questions that go around it, including basically first is what's in the pot, right? What funding sources are we talking about when we say how are we going to distribute these funding sources, and what kids programs are they intending to serve? So sort of defining your parameters. What's prioritized? Most often there's never enough funding to do everything we want to do. So what are we prioritizing? Where are we putting more dollars in, whether that's on specific weights or includes more things in a resource-based formula? And then how are we thinking about this? If this is a state formula, how are we thinking about the local aspect of this? So how are local contributions considered or what's required? And then we move into distribution mechanisms. So how is funding going to be delivered, and then does it need to be adjusted based on certain things coming through or not coming through? So that's generally what we talk about when we're talking about funding formulas. If we move forward one slide here. Your MRP, like I said, is basically a weight-based formula. And I should just pause and ask. How familiar is everyone with the minimum foundation program MFP for Louisiana's K-12 program? Not at all to very, very.
As familiar as you can be without having a master's degree.
Okay, all right.
We could pop down the hall, we saw the MFP task force.
We did, yes.
We were like, I think we'll go to that. Yeah.
Yeah, we all. Yeah.
But working understanding.
Working understanding. Okay, great. Then we can probably skim through this, but it is, you know, generally a weight-based formula. And I think what that basically means is you come up with, at the end of the day, a formula is an equation, right? And so you have an amount per student, the number of students in the MFP here would not be necessarily students, but amount per student, number of students, and then you get the annual amount of funding needed, and then you figure out what portion is funded by local versus state. What's really interesting in funding formulas is the decision points, right? The priorities and the parameters that you're putting in here, those are the inputs. So funding formula is not as simple as, 1 times 2 equals 2, that's a bad analogy, but something times something equals something, right? It's much more like a big algorithm in a formula. Like your MFP legislation is 33 pages long, right? So it's a big equation, but it's an equation. And the interesting part here is the decision points that you have in there, the parameters you're going to put in and the priorities that you're going to put in. So all that being said, we're going to stay on the simple version of the MFP today and think about how might that apply to ECE. And some of it will be yes, definitely, and some of it will be absolutely not. And again, all reactions and all input here today is valid. I'm accidentally going back. There we go. Okay. I was doing so well on progressing slides.
So at a simple level, we broke this into 5 steps of how the MFP allocates funds.
And if I can just say, we probably used a bad analogy here because your MFP actually has 5 steps. And the first one is the biggest one, step 1, which basically comes up with overall how much funding is going out to districts, but then you have steps after that that add different components onto it. So we're basically we're in our version.
We're in the first piece here.
Of the
yeah. So and I know that there have been things layered on over the years that make it more complicated, but just sort of starting from the kind of base of like how does it conceptually work. I think we are probably not going to, so our idea here is to take each of these and to talk about within this what would work and what would not work for ECE. We're probably not going to get through all 5 of these today, so we'll sort of start with the first couple of them. But just to kind of give the overview, which sounds like folks are mostly familiar with, there's a minimum foundation amount. It's the name of the minimum foundation program that would give about $4,000 as of 2023. That's a per child amount. The next thing that happens is that there are weights set. So Bessie said recommends weights, the state legislature approves them. And those are for things like special education status and economically disadvantaged, and then how much those adjustments are going to be. So what percentage for each of those gets set. So those are kind of like, that's in the amount per student category. And then we move to the how many students. So there's a count every year based on the previous year of both how many students does the district have and then how many qualify for the weights. There's also some adjustment here that happens around scale. So to the point of like concentration or rural areas, very small districts get an adjustment at this stage or like an economy of scale kind of increase. That's it. So then we've got amount per student, we've got how many students, and then we need to know who pays what out of the amount that's needed. And so the local contribution is calculated based on a formula that uses their ability to raise local revenue. Across the state, the aim is to have local revenue make up 35% of funding on average. For some parishes that's higher, some it's lower. That's also not currently what the breakdown is, but that's another story for another day. And then so that tells you how much is the state kicking in, how much is local government kicking in. And then the last step is allocation. So school districts receive their state funding amount and they have discretion to determine how to allocate that across schools and programs. So it goes to the school district and they decide how to spend it. So we're going to take each of these in turn. But before we do that, just a quick moment for reflection on the MFP itself. What do you all see as sort of the strengths of this process and the challenges? Are there things kind of first glance that clearly you feel like you apply to ECE or don't? Before we kind of dive into each step.
Yeah, just in the broadest sense, I mean, my sense is that our MFP is stronger than what a lot of states have in promoting equity and allowing for different economic conditions in different parishes. So that, so I think, I'm not an expert on how every other state does it, but my general sense is that this is one of the things that Louisiana does better than a lot of states.
in fact, court order, but
Yeah, back order.
You got there. Yeah. So in terms of waiting for students with economic disadvantage and in terms of figuring out local contributions in a way that's sort of fair across different.
Yeah, putting the right incentives,
Mhm.
you know, encouraging local school districts to put as much as they can. But allowing for the fact that some students that don't have the same economic base as others.
So without punishing folks who have fewer, like a less of tax base, it incentivizes local investment.
I would say this all holds up to part 3, and then after that, it.
Things break down. Yeah, so say a little more about that, what do you,
Kind of just to go what Jan said, you know, with local contributions and then like local allocation. So with ECE, you're not just dealing with public schools, you're dealing with private businesses, nonprofits. So what does that look like in the distribution? To a true privately run ECE business? You get into like then, you know, more lower level, like how much is the director making? Where is that funding going? Is it really truly going to the students? So I think at MFP K through 12, this works because it's all more of a state-run entity. But after number 3, I think it would bring that for early ed.
It's like, I was just thinking, you know, with the MFP, there's a percentage that goes towards retirement. Because that's one of the questions we get asked, like, how much is this really going into these kids? And you would say, okay, if it's going to a childcare center, you can count where it's going, whereas versus the MFP to K-12 students, you've got a portion that goes into retirement. That's significant. That's not going to the students.
so you can see really clearly the ECE connection up through step 3, and then it starts to be like, well, what does accountability look like? Who's making governance decisions about how these things are, how funds are used? And then you also have a different kind of structure in terms of employment and pensions that doesn't translate.
But I would say like that with the accountability in ECE, we know that no public dollars are going into a childcare center that is not part of the community system. So we've got that, but like to the point of local allocation, what we hear locals say is don't penalize us because we're able to raise more money for the ECE fund, but then you're also on the flip side. Not every parish can raise the kind of money that others.
Yeah, the matching fund really is like almost the reverse of how the MFP works in this way, right? It's incentivizing local investment, but it's also like really leaning toward parishes that have the ability to do that. They can draw down a lot more funds. Parishes that don't have that tax base or that ability are much more limited in how much like the state funds they'll be able to access. So it's like, it's great for moving folks in that direction and also has this kind of like tension and drawback.
Had enough revenue going into the incentive fund that was really meeting the needs of locals, then you could potentially equitably distribute the remainder of those funds to locals that couldn't.
Or you could have a variable match, where you could say you get a 2-to-1 if you have less space or something like that.
Or try and encourage regional pooling in some capacity.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was already starting that works in some places, that some of them are more regional based too, like
But it seems like that's a way to get more parishes equipped to access the money that's available through that fund, although of course, we don't necessarily have enough money in that fund for everybody who might be about to do this, but if you can get regions to work collaboratively, which I realize is easier said than done. So to try and come up with revenue. There seems like there's a way perhaps to try and incentivize that some fashion through that.
We've been using sort of the parish as a local unit, but there's no reason it has to be the parish, right? You can think about what is a regional.
already starts that are multi-parish, so like there's
There's some precedent for that.
On the subject of things that the MMP does well, which there's a lot of skepticism there, but setting weights, I think is a good model of trying to figure out, I mean, obviously educating a student with special needs costs more and should be prioritized. And so I think that setting of weights in the MFP is a critical piece to what the MFP actually does reasonably well.
I would say number 1, the amount per child for ECE would have to vary because it's much greater for infants than it would be for pre-K. So if that's not a varied amount, it would probably equal out and we lose.
Right, if it's like an average across different age groups, you're gonna incentivize serving the cheaper to serve kids and not the more expensive kids, right? Yeah, we're definitely going there next.
So a base amount could be like, here's what a base amount is for an infant, here's what a base amount is for a 4-year-old. That's what.
Yeah, the MOP actually has very little adjustment for age, even like high school, and there's a very small adjustment for high school and middle school, but it's like $59 a child or something, like it's really not significant, which is interesting because it is like classes are different, resources are different, you know, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great transition to kind of our next step here, which is to take each of these piece by piece. So the first is the base funding amount. And I think exactly what you just said, right? We know we have previous, so the way that these are structured is, here's what the MFP does, here's some considerations for early childhood, things that have already been done, things we need to think about, and then what should, you know, some questions for you all. So the MFP base funding amount is, as far as we can tell, largely historical and based on available funding. There may have been some work on it or just to set it many years ago, but it's been sort of stable and adjusted a little bit over time. We know that there's previous work for ECCE on what is the cost of care, and the rate setting work that was done recently can be a really good foundation for something like this in ECCE. Exactly what you just said, we probably would need some adjustment based on age of child, which is not done in the MFP. Curious if you all have thoughts about what would be like a process for determining an amount like this. Are there drawbacks here that we might want to avoid, or things to consider here from the ECCE perspective?
I wonder, it wasn't, I mean, federally you have to do like market rate survey, they're trying to do, but you know, our MFP is pretty hard to change. So how, and this can't be because of federal requirements of what we have to do to meet block grant things, but also like knowing that inflation happens and the cost of care goes up over time. I'm like, so how do you set a balance to that?
I would say too, something that should be looked at would be the cost of care of what it is now versus what it really truly should be. To account for what would be like true teacher pay, what's deserving, like what a center really needs to function, not what it is currently.
And to function with the teacher pay, but of course the quality has all the aspects of quality of which the quality teacher is one.
It's always a good start.
Yeah, Candace and our team led a Tiger team to look at wages, professional wages for professional, however it was named. In there it has a stair step on how to look at wages.
So using like a wage scale as
Yeah.
as a sort of an input to this to understand.
It's an Elizabeth
Yeah.
kind of like what it should be.
Yeah, this is a challenge we see, you know, we in our work in other states too, is you want to move people toward that true cost, right? That sort of competitive compensation and quality, and also you know that that's not the reality of the system today. And so are you funding, you know, towards something that's not there yet? How do you, what's the accountability piece of like making sure that if you're going to give folks more funding than they currently have, that it gets used for wages, you know, or in a way that can used for quality, it's not, it can be a tricky balance. But yeah, it may be that there's sort of there's a today base rate and there's a tomorrow base rate, you know. And I think about that in terms of like inflation too, right? What is the sort of adjustment over time piece, which when I look at the MFP number, which hasn't moved very much since 2008, that seems like a real challenge for districts. I know there have been other things that have sort of been layered on top of that to try to make up for some of those cost of living changes.
Yeah, so we think about funding formulas, almost like we would need two bases. The one being what are we funding today, and then if we change nothing, but when in an amount to cover the true cost of care, what would the base be? from then, we can start thinking about what it would look like to adjust under different scenarios.
And the quality piece could be weighted that too, to think about, if you're higher up on the wage scale.
Could there be a mechanism for inflation too? Because if I think about like our provider, like what you're paying for food costs, right? Those, sure.
Oh my gosh.
It would have to be a different thing.
Yeah, it would be not,
Right,
so I think that would be a difference, right?
Well, it was for one.
Yeah, I think it might be helpful to sort of think too about like what are the things that got in the way there, right? Like, you run into a recession, you know, like,
Available funding.
available
Available, we're gonna have for the-
yeah, it's the challenge
Yeah.
across all of it. Anything else on the base rate that we wanna? If there are any other folks that you wanna point us to talk about things like request of care or. Other resources to draw from, we were gonna sort of sketch out like. I think we have the work that's been done on cost of care the last couple of years, that's a starting place there. Who do eights? Keep it on one. So the MFP process here, as we said, is pretty straightforward. Betsy sets the adjustments for weights based on child and family characteristics, and the state legislature approves them. We did a little chart of current CCAP rates, which are weighted for certain needs against, and then MFP weights or adjustments. You can see they're like quite different in some cases. So both CCAP and the MFP adjust for children with special needs, but for CCAP, it's a 26% increase. For the MFP, it's 150% increase. So that's a very different range. Economically disadvantaged is a little bit different. All children receiving CCAP are economically disadvantaged. So there's not an adjustment there. The MFP gives a 22% bump. We talked about age of child, looks pretty different across the two settings. CCAP gives a quarterly bonus for quality ratings. The MFP doesn't particularly do any kind of funding adjustment based off of like quality or test scores or anything like that. The last two probably don't really apply to early childhood gifted students and I think career and technical education, although it'd be very cute, probably not really something we're talking about for 3-year-olds. So I think we know that they, at least so far I've heard that the concept of weights does resonate for ECCE, that we feel like this is a strength of the MFP that we would want to build off of. Are there other things that we should be considering or other things that are in the MFP that we might want to bring through? And I'm also curious if you all have thoughts about how we might think about the size of the weight or adjustment to sort of line it up with cost and incentives, knowing that there can be pretty wide variation here.
And one thing not reflected here, it's also 22% for English language learners in the MFP.
Special needs percentage obviously would need to go up. We in the Wills Parish struggle with that because we see a high rate of special needs children, but not a lot of centers who are equipped with the right staff or space, facilities, to take care of those kids. So really what happens is the parents don't work, they want to work, but they can't. You know, the closest center that would be to us is about an hour away, and they're always full with a really long waiting list. We have tried to take in, we say like 1 per child per classroom, but what we found is it really takes a whole extra teacher to manage that situation in addition to the teachers that we already have in the classroom. So financially, it's not really a good business model, unfortunately. But there is a great need for special needs kids.
I think this is something that the K-12 field generally, and I can't speak to Louisiana, but generally has done really well. It's a lot of advocacy modeling on the cost of serving children with special needs, and different requirements within IEPs. And I do wonder the ways in which we can use cost of care modeling to think about, you know, what would it look like to create more inclusive settings? What would the cost be? What's the sort of tipping point to be able to afford an in-class, you know, either an additional floater across multiple classrooms or an additional, you know, like a para in classroom. And so I think there's a lot of ways that you can use cost of care to understand what that amount would have to be. And we have lots to look to in the K-12 space that is worked out.
I think it's interesting thinking about it like birth to 3, because you often have kids who don't necessarily have a formal like IFSP yet, right? Sometimes they come in with that, but a lot of times you're acknowledging, you're identifying something, you're going through that evaluation process with the family, and if we peg it to the formal, you know, like in K-12, I think it makes sense to peg it to an IEP. In early childhood, it might make sense to think more about how do we build inclusive settings generally, and then you can like plug kids in as they arrive with those needs, as opposed to, you know, there's pros and cons, right, to like tying it to the individual kids IFSP.
I mean, this is where I think it's interesting in the MFP where, you know, we've mostly talked about level 1 funding, but there is additional funding we think about in K-12. There are outplacements or children with special needs above and beyond like 3 times the amount of foundational funding. So what would it look like to be thinking about sort of a, you know, not necessarily reimbursement, I know I'm trying to move away from that, but a specific provision that isn't necessarily weight-based, but could be another way to think about adding resources into a funding formula.
But at the same time, like, we have a lack of providers, PI providers, that are able to support the kids in inclusive settings too. So, you know, if we're thinking about a CCAP rate, I think at the same time, I think our early intervention peeps in Part C would really appreciate how do we think about together, not just Department of Ed, but also within LDH, like how do we make sure that we're able to incentivize to have more providers and for them to actually provide the support that's really needed in the classroom.
Yeah, thinking about like a coaching or consulting kind of model too, where there's support for the teacher as well as for the child.
Yeah, someone who used to do that type of work, like it's really hard and you need to be in it consistently over time to help kind of write that shared relationship.
Yeah, I think, you know, I look at the 150% weight, and the first thing that my mind goes to is like, is this incentivizing something, like, because the weight is so large and it's not varied by student need necessarily. I think there's a question there of like, what incentive does that create for a school district? I don't have any evidence to, or, you know, I've not done the look at that to see if that's what's happening, but I think there's some, it's worth thinking through, like, how do you identify kids with special needs, how do you identify what the needs are, how do you match that up with the cost, or live a little bit more of a like a fine grained thing, to the extent that's possible, which is hard.
And you don't always know about special needs, right?
Right.
Early on.
Yeah, and it really looks, I mean, in probably we call it a developmental delay or something like that, you know, at those ages, and it might take a full year of the child being in childcare to go through that process of.
But we also have like restrictive eligibility here in the state of Louisiana, so we're in a lot of states it should be easier to get into birth to 3. And it's a little bit harder because you have more requirements in 3 to 5. We've really restricted our eligibility for birth to 3 in the state, and our numbers continue to go up. So if you think about the kids that we know about, there are all these kids in the gray area that would really benefit from support, but because of eligibility, they're not.
And I mean, to that point, is there anything that's correlated? Is there anything that may be correlated that we would think about should be something that's weighted?
I mean, another approach is, you know, we could take the percentage of children with special needs in the school district in that parish and say, okay, we're going to assume the same percentage of kids, you know, in the early childhood system have special needs, knowing that some of them aren't identified yet, but that it'll emerge. But then there's sort of a question of where do those kids end up, and how do you make sure that you're incentivizing providers to take kids?
We did a study with the Build Initiative related to EI about like what would be potential steps as the state of Louisiana could do to help that system too. And I don't know if any of that might be helpful.
It seems like one fundamental category that is missing, and part of this may have been conversation earlier, but it seems like any formula built for ECE, at least until we ensure universal access, needs to in some way incentivize access in places where there's not been access. So there's sort of a need to do something in ECE that we just assume is already done in K-12. Like you can go to a school if you want to, and the United States today, K-12 you cannot in early ed in some places. So there's some heavy weight that needs to be incentivized there for some period of time.
So are you talking about more kind of like a regional or a local, like a sort of community level?
Could be any and all. I mean, I think it depends how granular you can thoughtfully get in a way that can be built into a policy, but in a world where you can't, there's not a high quality space within a 20-minute drive, 30-minute drive, like practically it's not access.
Something around deserts.
Yeah. Now, I don't know that we can get that granular, so maybe it has to be a parish level, maybe it has to be whatever, but something of that nature where we're not up to universal access, it strikes me that we ought to at least as heavily weight that. In the same way that, you know, to the point of a special needs adjustment, like, I'm not convinced our MFP weighting does anything to actually incentivize serving special needs better. But if we're gonna incentivize something, you ought at least incentivize doing the thing that is harder and needed. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting but that it makes me think about is it weight based off of the characteristics of the community, not the characteristics of the child being served, which is sort of a different approach. But I like that. I like that idea of thinking about like what are the characteristics of the community that need, and then how do we like match that up with the funding?
I think that's
source.
also a really good thread to pull through, because that is it's a different lens in which you look at an early childhood, early care and education system.
Yeah, that feels really exciting to me because I think it's, you know, to some of these challenges about like identifying the specific needs of that specific kid. If you think about it at the community level, there are data sources we could draw from. There are, you know, things that we could pull from
So I
there.
think of like Jefferson Parish too, what we're taught, like you've got inside really dense areas, you do still have deserts, but then you also have like a higher growth in population of Hispanic population. And so like that Ready Start network has done a lot of work around teachers to make sure that they have, you know, Spanish speaking teachers and people that can support families, and like what does that look like for a community that has a high number of families that need that?
Yeah, so thinking about it at the regional level, what are those needs that are not being met, and what's the cost of meeting those needs?
I would say I did raise a question earlier about just kind of the challenge of thinking about the system scale when we were trying to provide access for this certain group of kids, but there may not be a system. I think that might be a solution, or at least partial solution to address that. One other that's been bouncing around my head, another weight might be just the cost of providing the service. If you think about it through the provider, you know, that could be as simple as rent that's paid on a rent or the mortgage on a facility, but even the cost of labor in different parts of the state. Thinking about this,
Do you have a regional adjustment to the cost of care? Yeah, I think this is this is an important question. I think for Judy, we think about wages and compensation, that like that could look like the New Orleans labor market and the, you know, rural labor market might look very different. And thinking about what's needed in those different places should lead us to a different outcome. And one way to do that would be by setting different base amounts. Other would be thinking about it in a weights-based approach.
And what if like we have about 8 minutes left? Want to make sure we're holding time and bring minutes.
We don't need that. Let's do one more.
Okay, we're gonna do one more.
Yeah. So the last one we'll talk about today is counting students. So seems straightforward, but it's not. The district, the way the MFP does it is they do their enrollment as of February 1st of the previous year. So they use kind of a year lag data. And that's also used to determine children who qualify for the weight adjustments. I think this is where we get into some of the questions we've been discussing about population. I think there's a lot of different ways, to your point about like, we sort of assume that every kid goes to a K-12 school somewhere, well, you know, some school, but for ECE, we don't have that assumption. So we could think about a lot of different populations of children. I think I'm hearing pretty clearly that we want to go beyond children who are like currently enrolled in a publicly funded program, right? We want to think about expanding access. There are also children who are currently enrolled in some kind of formal care, whose families might be below a certain income threshold, even if they're not currently getting, you know, public assistance for that. There are children who need care but are not yet in a formal setting, right? Children who have all parents in the workforce, or we can sort of make an assumption about 2/3 of kids might need care. There's also, you know, we can think about an income threshold for that, or like all children under 5 in an area. I don't think we're necessarily going to land on like, this is our population. I think we're thinking about different scenarios here, but are there other possible scenarios that we should be considering, either from this list or outside of this list? And then I think there's also a question about like, how often do you count children? I mean, with CCAP, it's a month-to-month thing, right? They every month they have a different number of kids enrolled, but they're getting funded based off of districts only do it once a year for the MFP. So that's a pretty different, and that has implications for stability too, right? In terms of their funding levels, but also in terms of, you know, incentives and level funds and all of that too. So, what does this raise for you all when you think about population of children and how we count kids?
I know there are federal laws that require like counting of kids in a certain way, depending on the program. Are there any restrictions we have to comply with at the start?
Yes, there are. The contracted slots piece of it allows for some, I think the slot has to be filled, right? But you can contract with the provider for, I think it's a year, right? To be able to, yeah, people know more about this than I do, but so that there are different ways that you can have that relationship with a provider that might allow for some flexibility in terms of how you think about funding the slot. They have to have it filled for a certain amount of time, but
there's not like a requirement for a monthly count.
I'm not definitively sure. Nothing is coming to my mind that I've seen as a rule, but I can't guarantee that. I would want to check with our federal partners to know that.
It just feels like that's the first place to start. Is
I mean, it's in our policy.
since so much of this is federal funding.
So it is in state policy that we do the count twice a year.
Right, but it obviously changing a state law is simpler. Right.
and I'd say like generally the push at the federal level has been toward things that improve provider stability, at least current policy environment, right? So not that that's never going to change, but generally there's been a desire to move in that direction federally too.
I mean, one thing I just point out relative to what I said earlier, the model that we use in K-12 does not particularly adjust well for growth. And in a world where you're trying to expand access, you need to figure out how you, in some ways, prepay for services that will be done in order to enable enough cash flow for the work to happen. Is a reimbursement model or a what did you do last year model inherently decreases the ability to serve in areas that have not been served before. So that will have to be adjusted for in some way while also mitigating, obviously prepaying has risk to it, right? You lose that money, but
Yeah.
That's, I think, the only way you can theoretically get something to grow if you're gonna be heavily publicly funded.
Yeah, and when we talk to providers about this, they like, one thing that really struck me is they do not have a lot of margin, right? In these businesses, like if they're not getting their payment for that month, they are not making payroll for that month. So it's not like they have access to, you know, like pools to draw from to help them expand before they get, you know, so I think that's a really important point. And I think this point about risk is a really important point too. What level of risk is comfortable, right? To be able to say, we actually funded more slots here than it turned out people wanted. And we'll adjust that in future years, but like, does it feel like an existential risk to say like, we have some slots that are going unfilled in some areas because we, you know, we got a little ahead of our skis.
Well, and I mean, theoretically, you could use the model that, at least in sort of the charter school world, they've used where you've got a quasi public-private, we call it the charter school growth fund model, where you've got sort of this entity that can sort of from a quasi philanthropic angle, say, okay, here's what we think your margin's gonna be over 3 years. And if we wind up losing something, we'll adjust in year 2, we'll adjust in year 3 versus it being a formula. You could use our incentive fund that we've got today to sort of do some of that, with some creative arrangement.
Reduces the risk of like using public dollars in a way that,
Yeah, I mean, you could either raise private money or you could use an incentive fund that in theory is designed to incentivize local investment, et cetera.
and some
versus
of
it
that
being
is the
formula.
incentive fund is philanthropy, and so there's maybe some, yeah. Here's some folks have ideas about populations we should be thinking about. Here I've heard at risk, like serving all kids who are in the sort of at risk category, and then thinking about what that would mean to expand access to all kids who need care, including those in higher income brackets.
It would seem like for a funding formula to work, you would need a sliding scale depending on the amount of money available, where you prioritize at-risk kids first. And then go up income level depending on funding. I think we're not gonna do, it seems unlikely we would do something like the MFP where we automatically fund everybody and the legislature just has to provide that amount of money. So it seems like a formula would have to have some flexibility in terms of who is served and linking it to available revenue.
Our goal is 66% of all kids, like, figure out the cost of that, right?
Yeah, I think all kids we can, all kids 0 to 3, all kids 0 to 4, yeah,
Yeah,
right.
And then make intentional prioritization.
and then
decisions on
prioritize
stair
those that,
steps
yeah.
there.
Yeah, I'm very appreciative of that. When you said sliding scale, it also made me think about what's the parent contribution piece, which I think if you're thinking about in that risk population, you're probably not really thinking about parent contributions as a big component of that. But when you go up to
But as you move up,
66% of all kids, the standard nationally and federally has been that there's some parent or family, contribution, and that's capped at a certain percentage of income and that kind of thing.
Because like if you look at our poverty rate plus our ALICE rate,
Yeah,
you're at 51% of our population, so. Every other neighbor is really struggling.
Yeah.
And so how do we get to a point to what y'all were talking about for those families that they're not gonna qualify for CCAP, but they are still like, they don't know how to do it.
the out-of-pocket cost, especially when you start talking about raising wages, quality, it's untenable.
And 2/3 seems to kind of fit that. Then you're
Yeah.
doing the poverty population, the ALICE population, and folks who may be above the ALICE threshold, but still,
need help.
if you have a couple of kids in childcare, it's still a big financial strain and they're gonna need some support.
Some support, yeah, and there's also, I think part of the reason why you provide them is like, some people prefer to stay home with their kids when they're young, and so there's some element of like, not everybody's gonna be in formal care. In the same way that there's sort of mandatory attendance for
Grandparents
K-12.
live next door or something.
Right, yeah,
This is really in the weeds, but I think just worth mentioning, so we find that the kids who are at highest risk. Who need the most help, we know like we're the center where they get their daily food and oftentimes their baths. Are not going to be the parents who currently have a job, or are going to school. So those kids that are in most need don't qualify for CCAP either, because that's an underlying factor to receive CCAP. So oftentimes when CCAP was a little faster, we would take those kids in and just cut that as a loss, knowing that those kids are the ones that really truly need care, and then hope that CCAP would come in. We're not able to do that any longer currently, just because the wait time sometimes is 6-7 months, and we just can't provide free care for that long. But I think it's worth talking about. We talk about like at risk, and the kids that really truly are the most at risk are the kids that oftentimes don't qualify for CCAP too.
so looking at eligibility criteria alongside. Yeah, and I also, I think that's, it's a really challenging piece of it, that's a federal requirement that's, I don't see changing, unfortunately.
Not changing, but
Ever.
we're just happening.
Unfortunately.
Because we talk about,
but,
most at risk, and depending on your parish, I think that changes.
But I think like where are the state, like, where's the wraparound to that, right, that, and there are political challenges for sure, but think about like what other things are going on in that child's life that might be criteria for thinking about, just unstable housing or, child welfare involvement or those kind of things where there might be a reason to come in, with some supplemental, yeah, and how do you make sure that,
Then I would think a way to, on the waste discussion would be those kids that are in the foster care system.
yeah, and I think that like homeless workspace too is like a piece of that, yeah.
I guess just to piggyback off of what Libby just said about foster care, so like at our center, we do have foster care kids, but we are paid significantly less for foster. And we try to allow those slots because we do have a lot of foster kids in our parish. We have a great relationship with a lot of our foster parents who need that emergency, like I got a kid last night and I need care tomorrow.
Yeah.
But we know taking those kids in, we're getting, I think, $67 versus what we would for CCAP, so like 130. So we take a loss on foster, but
And probably high, a child with a lot of need coming in.
high needs.
Yeah, traumatic experience, right? So, and I think that also speaks to like the fragmented system, right? There's a different funding source paying for that, that's a separate process and yeah, not aligned to the need. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm done.
A real quick question now,
right.
why wouldn't the CMS rates match what LD units are? And if that, I mean, I know it's not happening, so like, what do we need to do to make that better? These little ones are.
The ones that need, and we've asked that, at our level several times. The way that funding comes in is really hard too, because it lags sometimes by 6-8 weeks. Kids are coming for free and we're constantly on the phone like, hey, we really need our money, so the funding stream is wonky, the amount is wonky. I don't have the answer, I just know that it's not something equitable.
All right, well, that's good.
I do think that in the new system, I believe the department is going to be in a foster directly. Rather than see if that's once that's good, but. That's not really helping,
So just as a little preview, I think all the questions that you all raised about the local role in this are probably the next thing we're going to go deep with this group on. I'm not sure exactly when or when the next meeting that we'll be at, because I know you all have other things on your plates that you need to tackle, but we definitely want to talk more about those questions with you. We are over time, so we'll do the checkout questions, but just really appreciate your engagement and having us, and we're really excited on this direction. Well, so much. Our emails are on there. I know we have a data follow-up request on the slots per child by parish that we can get out through. Thank you all so much. Thank you.
Speech.
Please
take that on.
And then I make my way back to what I mean, I forgot. Gonna get it. If there is a technical. That's great job. Yeah, I love it. 10 a.m.
Friday. Well, your statement was in my email.
You're good.
Yeah.